I don't see vendor lock-in as that big of a deal. In my case, what I've seen that vendor lock-in is really a trade-off between risk and cost. You can always migrate off a product. The question is how much risk and cost do you want to incur?
This is Sovereign DBaaS Decoded, a podcast for IT leaders and implementers looking to reliably scale database ops while maintaining control of their data stack. In each episode, we join industry experts to discuss the what and why of sovereignty and how you can implement the Sovereign DBaaS concept of your own using open source databases, deployment models, and tooling. Let's get started.
Hello, and welcome to the first episode of Sovereign DBaaS Decoded. I'm Vinay Joosery. I'm the CEO of Severalnines, and this episode is brought to you by Severalnines. We provide enterprise automation software that orchestrates your high availability open source database operations in any environment while maintaining total control. So our guest today is Sanjeev Mohan, Principal Analyst at SanjMo and former Vice President at Gartner Research. Thanks for joining us, Sanjeev.
Thank you so much, Vinay, for having me. I feel honored to be part of your very first episode of your podcast series.
And we are very, very excited to kick off this series. So Sanjeev, we have done a webinar earlier this year, right? For the purpose of our guests here, can you tell us a bit about your background and your current role at SanjMo?
I've been in data management space pretty much my entire life, and I just fell into it. Started my career way back in the 90s when I joined Oracle. One of the first companies I worked at was in Oracle, where I got very deep into the database management systems. And then the whole .com boom happened, and then the cloud movement started with Hadoop and all that. So there's never been a dull moment. But the most exciting part of data is right now. And I joined Gartner many years ago, worked there as an analyst. I was responsible for the agenda for data management for many years. But then last year, I decided that, I want to expand my coverage and do more different kinds of projects. So I started my own company. It's called SanjMo. Now I am into this about 1 year and 3 months. I have to say, never a dull moment, and just living this life of this golden era of data and how important data is, and just reveling in all the advancements that are taking place. You can tell my love for data because it is so foundational to everything that we do. Vinay, what do you think?
Yes, absolutely. Everything is data driven nowadays, and companies are collecting lots of data and processing lots of data and analyzing data to actually make good use of it. So yeah, I've been in the database business for 22 years now. Worked for database companies, and it's also been sort of a passion to help companies with data infrastructure.
No, you've been quite a pioneer. You were very early on into the MySQL.
Yes. So I joined MySQL, I think it was in 2003, at that time it was the early days of open source. Companies thought it was a bit funny to have a database that was open source. Actually, the concept of open source, right? Even when walking into enterprises, they knew about MySQL, but they would kind of smile and smirk and, thought, oh, well, what are these guys really selling, right? So, but things have changed after so many years. But it was a great journey. And at around that time, you also had this thing called cloud, which was still early days. The cloud has been around maybe now 15 years. And I guess you've been following the database market as well during all that time. So, in your thoughts, Sanjeev, how has the cloud deployment model evolved, right, since its inception, and especially related to databases?
It's very interesting what we are seeing in the cloud right now. So as we are recording this in late 2022 of autumn or fall of 2022, we are seeing economies slowing down. In fact, every day we see like big numbers of job losses. So economy is cooling down, IT spend is going down. However, one place that continues to grow is cloud computing. So no slowing down there, maybe not at the same pace as before, but still it's a very, very healthy pace. I think I saw Gartner estimate the entire tech spend, the technical infrastructure spend is at about $919 billion as of now. 25% of that is in the cloud. So in the cloud, we've gone through this very interesting journey. When it was new, we were just dumping stuff into the cloud, what we call lift and shift or IaaS. And then we went into, no, let's just take advantage of cloud computing. We went into platform as a service. And, and now I see actually two interesting trends. Now that we've reached, like you said, this 15-year maturity mark, there are two trends I see. On one hand, people want more and more managed services. In other words, they don't want to spend their time and effort trying to manage the underlying resources. Actually, AWS calls it undifferentiated tasks that's an overhead. So they want more SaaS, so software as a service. They want more serverless. But then I also see the more mature companies, on the other hand, they want more control and they want more choices. They may have larger workloads, so cost is a big issue. So they won't be able to pick and choose how their products are or their applications are deployed. Where are they deployed? There could be other factors that come in the picture, which we'll talk about as we go through this. But those are the two trends. One camp, managed services all the way. Second camp, give me control, give me choices that put me in the driver's seat.
Right. Yeah. That's sort of clear. And I guess maybe the SMBs, the smaller companies, would just go all in and just leverage the maximum they can from the cloud. Whereas maybe the large enterprises, they might have things like compliance requirements, regulations to follow. And from that perspective, maybe they have special requirements where they need to be a bit more flexible, right?
Yes.
And those managed services might be a little bit too restrictive sometimes. But the thing is, so Sanjeev, the cloud market is dominated by, free companies, really. AWS, Azure, Google. Then there are some other very powerful cloud, companies, but everybody talks about these free hyperscalers, right? They command, those free, around 2/3 of the global cloud spend, right? How did you get here?
I think it's quite typical, at least in the US. We always have a very limited number of leaders. Whether it's fast food restaurant or it's beverages. There's not a lot of choices when it comes to the top tier. Globally, it's different though. So we've got three big hyperscalers in the US, but China has its own. Interestingly, Europe, I keep reading and hearing for years, Europe is going to finally have its own cloud provider, but it doesn't. We do have some small ones. DigitalOcean went IPO some years of not too long ago, and it's been very successful. Then we've got other providers like Ivan that provides some database services on top. Asia has a few small ones. Cloud computing is a very, very cost intensive, high capital expenditure space. So it's very difficult for companies to actually announce their own cloud. I actually keep hearing that some large corporations might have their own cloud. I was just hearing about Walmart recently, but it'll only be for their own needs. So like Google Cloud, for instance, has expanded lately quite a bit. Oracle and IBM are close in the top providers also. But the reason I mentioned Google Cloud was because they own the submarine cable. So they've laid down that underlying infrastructure on top of which they can then build these data centers. But these data centers are a massive endeavor, high availability, disaster recovery, security, many layers of security, all those things make it very hard for more than a handful of players to come into the space.
Right.
What do you
Well,
think?
I mean, all this power concentrated in, pretty much those free providers, it doesn't sound very healthy to me, probably that's not what the internet was built for from the beginning, right? It's supposed to be decentralized, right? But, having so much power focused, right? And if you look at it, hyperscalers, they've hijacked all the attention, right, of the market. And if you're not doing stuff on Amazon, Google or, Azure, you can go to bed kind of thing, right? So it's just, it just sounds a little bit, unhealthy. But, we all know the dangers of, vendor lock-in with big tech firms like IBM and Oracle. They these two hold the largest awards, right, in this area. So vendor locking is a terrible thing, right? When you depend entirely on a vendor, right, without competition, or a way to move from that, right? So, but, if we look at the cloud, are AWS, Azure, and Google the new Oracle?
So Vinay, the best part about doing these podcasts and having this discussion is to foster different points of view. So I'm glad you mentioned vendor lock-in because I have a slightly different view of that. And my view is, you mentioned that are these hyperscalers the new oracles of the world? I know a lot of companies, and you do a lot of companies that have moved off Oracle to some of your open source companies or to other providers like native cloud provider technologies. So I don't see vendor lock-in as that big of a deal. In my case, what I've seen that vendor lock-in is really a trade-off between risk and cost. So you can always migrate off a product. The question is how much risk and cost do you want to incur? Because changing databases is not for faint of the heart. So some people may say, I don't want to incur that risk, so I pay the high cost. And some people are like, no, we will incur the cost because in the long run we can save money. So let's just take a leap and migrate to an open source database or to a cloud native database. So this is one aspect that I believe vendor lock-in is not as big a deal as we've made it. But on the other hand, I do want to mention that some vendor lock-in is actually necessary. If so, I had a colleague in Gartner who used to say that uh, choosing a vendor is like getting into a marriage, but your bags are always packed. You can always leave. And I thought that was a very terrible idea because what is the point of getting into a marriage? So there's some investment that even the users have to make. If there is no vendor lock-in, there's very little incentive for R&D because you never know whether you will get that revenue to fund your investment in your R&D or not. So I think there needs to be some sort of like uh, commitment from both the provider and the user. But I do agree that there's no interoperability between these cloud providers. Even if you have, let's say, PostgreSQL, open source, and you say, you're very proud of PostgreSQL. I'm running it in one cloud provider. I'm now going to move to another cloud provider. Guess what? You'll find out some of the extensions are not supported. A few things are done differently. There are all these tweaks, and you have to go through a whole migration process.
Right. And I mean, I would agree with you that, there needs to be some skin in the game because the vendor has to be able to plan their business. They need the revenue. They need, in a way, that's kind of what funds all the development, right? All the progress they make. And then, if we look at the reality, many of these enterprises, right, they have committed a certain spend in exchange of certain, discounts, right? Because sometimes if you look at the reports of the large companies, they're spending 30, 40, 50 million dollars, right? That they need to spend within, 2, 3, 4 years, right? And then it allows them to actually get very large discounts. But yeah, the point I was thinking was, being in Europe, we see a lot of companies, pretty much any smaller company that was born in the last 10 years, they are born in the cloud, right? Why would anybody else, why would you actually deploy on any other infrastructure, right? So when you're born in the cloud, you're relying services that are available only on a cloud provider, right? Moving away is possible, but
Yeah.
it has such a huge cost because the company cannot stop feature development for 1 or 2 years while you're migrating, the sort of infrastructure, right? Because obviously it's really carte blanche for your competitors to come in and actually take your market. And that's a big risk, right? Especially now we talk about things like Schrems 2 and GDPR regulation, right? Not being compatible when running your own databases on the US hyperscalers. And that can be quite disruptive, right? But let me say it like this. I mean, looking at the market research, are enterprises moving more workloads to the cloud? I mean, we can say, looking at what's out there, since the cloud is still growing, right, there is more workload moved, right? But are they doing it wrong?
Great question, by the way. And I saw, now it's like getting close to a year ago, that E16Z, Andreessen Horowitz, a VC firm, they came up with a very famous study about repatriation of workload back to on-premises. They gave some examples. Dropbox was one of them. So are companies moving their workloads to the cloud or back to on-prem? I would say uh, resoundingly, the workloads are moving to the cloud. They're not, I think it's just a matter of time. I think in a few years, we'll see a vast majority. Right now, it's actually very small. Right now, by some estimates, it's 15 to 25% of workloads are in the cloud. All the cloud takes up the entire oxygen in the room. It is actually in minority. Are enterprises right in moving to the cloud? Well, it really depends. Like, for example, let's say I have a lot of data. It doesn't matter whether it's on-prem or in the cloud, and I want to train a machine learning model. So to do that predictive analytics, I need a vast number of GPUs, let's say 1,000 of them. Where would I find those on-prem? If I have 1,000 GPUs sitting idle, that's a much bigger problem. But in the cloud, I can maybe pay a few dollars, train my model, and get the results. Actually, train the model, but then that model can actually be deployed on-prem. As the data comes into my applications on-prem, it is doing the inference. So the model is deployed on-prem, but it was trained in the cloud. You see that dichotomy? This is what makes it really interesting, when we can pick and choose our location based on our cost needs, latency needs, security needs, like Shrem2. Let's say I want to train this model and it's just filled with PII information. Well, guess what? I may have 1,000 GPUs in the cloud, but I won't be able to do it in the cloud unless I de-identify all that data. Well, that's an extra cost, an extra step. So maybe in such situations, I am forced to do it on-prem unless I can guarantee that this private data will remain secure in the cloud and I won't break the GDPR or Schrems 2 or any of these requirements.
Right.
Does
No,
that
it
make
does. It does. Although, I can imagine if you need a lot of capacity for a certain amount of time, and then you go and do something else, and then maybe after some period of time, then you again need such capacity, it might make sense not to own that capacity, right?
in the cloud, I can scale up and down and pay per use, hopefully, although some people say so, but then you get the bill. If that is not something that is to my advantage, then yes, I have to relook at my choices and say, well, if I'm not scaling elastically because I have predictable workload, I'm never scaling down, always need massive number of resources 24/7, then doing a cost value analysis and seeing should I run it on prem is a very
Yeah.
important thing. And one should
Yeah.
do it. absolutely. The oath to their
Yeah.
shareholders.
Yeah. I mean, and that's one thing when it comes to, TCO, right? In a way, if we want to avoid lock-in, right, then typically the best way is to settle for the lowest common denominator of the cloud providers, right? And this is usually IaaS. But I mean,
Yeah.
if using IaaS from the cloud, right, does it not defeat the purpose of using the cloud, right? Because services that operationalize not just the hardware, storage, and networking, but things like, data management, databases, caching, security, AI. What do you say there?
Oh, absolutely. Many years ago, I decided to get my solution architect certification for AWS. And I happily told some of my close friends and colleagues at that time, and they're like, oh, yeah, you'll have no problem. You'll ace it because you've been like dealing with databases and cloud for so long. That was very hard, I have to say. It was hard because I don't spend time doing identity and access management. I had never come across network ACLs and NATLs versus firewalls versus this policy and that rule. All of that, I don't need that. I'm a data guy. I mean, I'm trying to bring value out of data. If I go into IaaS, I have to then know all of these things. I have to know this belongs in this VPC and that belongs in this VPC, and then there's a this private link here and open these ports. If I can avoid that, I'm much more productive to my company. They're paying. They're let's say I have a PhD in computer science, and they've hired me as a data scientist, and I'm spending all my time mucking around with uh, infrastructure and all of these things. Then that's not a good use of my time. So I would say, unless absolutely necessary, IS may not be the best option for you. There are many cases where it is. So I'm not saying that always go for PaaS or SaaS. But if I am limited on resources and skills, then I do want to go to managed services.
Yeah. In a way, I would agree. But what I've also seen is even if you're using these, managed services, right, you still have DevOps teams who know what they're doing. Who need to know how to configure those services and how to, monitor them. And, so it's not like, okay, I'm using these services. That's it. Hands off. I don't need any DevOps, nothing. Right. So yeah, I mean, in a way, there's a lot of stuff done by the cloud provider, but I think the companies still need to have very qualified people who actually understand how these services work.
Yes, because there's, I mentioned how important agility, like cloud provides agility, but that is only one type of agility, which is infrastructure or the pipeline, the underlying. But then there's agility in your development process, CI, CD, versioning, the whole GitHub thing, and all that you still have to do. And that is also agility, which falls under DevOps. And in my case, I'm looking into DataOps now. So orchestration, automation, all that you don't get out of the box. And to your point about cloud providing services, well, when AWS started 15 years ago, it had three services. It had EC2, S3, and SQS, queuing service. That's it. Today it has 350 or some large number, and we are weeks away from AWS reInvent. We will see another slew of new services. So cloud is very uh, involved. In fact, sorry if I'm going too long, but I do want to mention, because cloud is so involved, this whole multi-cloud thing needs to be very carefully understood, because it you can spend your entire lifetime just learning one cloud provider. If you are saying I want to be true multi-cloud, I want my products to run in every cloud provider, well, good luck with that, because now you need to have three or two or three or four different cloud providers knowledge, which is asking for a lot.
Yes, totally agree there. I mean, that's sort of, you have different nomenclatures across the cloud providers. The services have different
Right.
behaviors. So it is hard to be vendor neutral, right? If you're using services that are kind of designed for and working in one cloud, and suddenly you say we're going to go multi-cloud. I mean, that's a tough run.
So yeah, this question used to come up constantly when I used to do client inquiries, and yes, you raise a really good point. Like, how do you stay vendor neutral when we've discussed all these constraints and all these things around? So you cannot be vendor neutral, but you can minimize it. Like I give the example of Postgres or MySQL. Actually, MySQL is a little bit tricky, but I'll give you another example. If you're doing streaming ingestion, you can or message bus kind of like idea. You can go with a cloud provider's native tools. If you do that, you have fewer moving parts because it's part of the ecosystem that cloud provider provides. So there's some pros. But if you go with Apache Kafka, for instance, or managed services of Kafka, now you have this freedom of moving from one cloud provider to another. Although all your tooling, DevOps, all that will have to also migrate. So it's not like out of the box kind of a thing, but you can minimize your dependence and your vendor lock-in.
Right. I mean, that's, if we would see, if we believe there's a lot of research out there saying enterprises are using minimum 2 free clouds anyway, public clouds, right? So the majority of the enterprises are multi-cloud, right? And now they might be segmenting, their workloads across the clouds, but the move is to actually be able to move between these cloud vendors as the enterprises see fit.
Right.
But that's tough, right? If you're going to take benefits of all these services from one cloud, right?
Yeah. So Vinay, so here is the funny thing. Most companies are multi-cloud, 100% true statement. But what does it really mean? When we start looking deeper, we then find out that there are so many different meanings of multi-cloud. I could be using, let's say, Snowflake. Snowflake runs on every cloud provider in the US. So in theory, yeah, I mean, my Snowflake instance can run in AWS, Azure, and GCP, for instance. So I'm multi-cloud. Or I may have, Workday or some like ERP system running in one cloud. My website is hosted in another cloud, and I'm doing something totally different in a third cloud. That's also multi-cloud. All those things don't really mean much because companies are multi-cloud, yes, but if those workloads are independent and isolated from each other, then it makes no difference. Use any cloud you want. Some organizations are in such a keen rush to go multi-cloud that they when I ask them, okay, so what are you doing? They'll be like, yeah, I'm in cloud provider A historically, but now we're experimenting with cloud provider B. But it turns out 90% of workloads are still in A, 10% are in B. So yes, you're multi-cloud. Things get interesting when it is a single workload that crosses multiple cloud. For example, I created my website 15 years ago, let's say 10 years ago, and I put it on AWS. At that time, AWS was the main cloud provider. I had no option. I put it in AWS. Now I want to do some machine learning analysis on that data. And for that, I want to use Google's BigQuery, whether it's machine learning or Azure ML or something like that. So I'm now taking the log data or the clickstream data from S3 and I'm moving it into Azure or GCP, and I'm doing my machine learning. That to me is when things get interesting because now the data is egressing. So there's cost, there's latency, there's residency requirement. You know, that is still not very common, although it's starting to happen a lot. My data sits in AWS, but all my users like to use Power BI. So instead of using Power BI in AWS, I'm using it in Azure. So you see that happening quite a bit.
I mean, the other thing with multi-cloud is reliability, right? So you want to have some kind of DR strategy. You need to have your data in some of the cloud. There's also things like regulations for banks in Europe that tells you need to have a cloud exit strategy, right? And which means you need to be able to have the same infrastructure somewhere else, right? As it's sort of a compliancy requirement. So there are many of these, I guess, requirements, different use cases for multi-cloud, right? Some workloads are partitioned, but some actually it's the workload from a certain system that's actually distributed across at least two clouds, and then you have ingress egress, right? And those systems can be pretty costly because egress. That's a huge cost, right? It's hard to predict, and it just it shows up big time.
So I think this whole process is very complex. I've seen egress costs, and there's always a prediction coming up. They're about to go away, but we haven't seen that. Oracle Cloud Infrastructure, OCI, actually does not have egress cost. Maybe others will follow that trend too. But that cost actually is not, it depends on the volume, of course, but in big scheme of things, it's not a very big cost. To me, the big cost is how do you, so you mentioned cloud concentration risk is what regulators are going after. So they're saying your DR should be in a different cloud. Now, let's say I'm in AWS and I'm using DynamoDB, large scale, or let's say I'm in GCP, I'm using Spanner. Well, how am I going to create a DR for that in a different cloud provider? These are proprietary technologies. These are not like open standards. Have you seen that? I mean, I don't know how, I can extract all my DynamoDB data into just JSON files because, it supports document database into another one. But if there's a failover I need to do in my target, I don't think I'll get the same service level agreements and the same customer experience if I've gone to a totally different database. So I'm just curious, what are your thoughts in doing this DR when you've got proprietary systems in cloud provider A?
I'm not sure how you handle it. I mean, actually, even the DR thing, if you've got if you've got 200 servers running, right, for entire BU, right, and that thing goes down and you need to have a DR strategy, you shouldn't take it for granted that you can just spin up 200 VMs on some other cloud, just like that, unannounced, right? Because we know when you are spinning up too many servers, right, dozens of servers, you got to call Amazon. You got to tell them in advance, hey, we are going to be spinning up a number of servers here, so we need that number. And so from that perspective, yes, you have the ability to to do DR, but yeah, I mean, first of all, you might not get the number of servers you need, and then the other thing is, if, for example, one of the major cloud providers, would have problems, then you won't be the only one looking for a backup plan. There's going to be many others, right?
Great point. Yeah, if I have let's say AWS, I have R4 dot extra large, something like that. I had to find out what is the equivalent in Azure and is that even available? And great point. If everyone is going, if there is a catastrophic event and people are migrating, there will not be any more instances to be had at that point in time. Great point.
Yeah. So what do we conclude then? This thing about, in a way, yes, use all the services from each cloud provider. Yes, go multi-cloud and try to somehow, be loosely coupled. But at the same time, if you want to be multi-cloud and you want to be able to move stuff around, you can't use too much of those proprietary services from each cloud provider because there's no one-to-one mapping to another cloud.
That is true. But then, See, this is where we need to, when we record the event, be practical. Not like in theory we can say a lot of things, do this, do that, but in theory, like I'm just thinking, like DynamoDB is used immensely, and Spanner, so so basically you just cannot, like I cannot make a statement and say, use a generic JSON database or key value store. So you can then be, because you may not get the performance, it's like uh, we are talking about, hundreds of billions of transactions a day. In many cases, let's say, we are getting close in the US to Thanksgiving, and these native tools are built for handling massive surges in volume, that some of the other providers may not be. So I don't have a good answer. I'm just saying, uh, another thought that crossed my mind was that now I'm coming across some clients, a few clients that have $1 billion spend in the cloud every year. So if you're going to do a DR in a different provider, you're not going to incur a few hundreds of millions of dollars of costs keeping peer capacity in case something goes down.
Yeah. And
So
again, I mean, talking about Black Friday, talking about certain events where,
right,
certain parts of the industry will actually see, much increased traffic, like a 10x increase, then definitely the cloud
right,
is the place, right? The issue is more if your traffic is sort of stable, right? I mean, if you
yeah,
look at, hardware and storage costs over the last 10 years, right? I
mm,
mean, they've gone down orders of magnitude, right? I mean, hardware today
mhm.
has, you can buy servers with many, many cores, lots of RAM, and
Oh yeah,
compared to the sort of to the cost 10 years ago, it's you know, I mean, today it's peanuts. But we can see also that those savings didn't translate onto the bills you pay to Amazon or Google, right? I mean, the costs have pretty much been constant there. So you can imagine all the profits, right, that these
yeah,
companies are making. And if you're an enterprise that have, for example, you do a lot of storage, you have very large storage needs. Why would you pay all these premium margins, right, to the cloud provider in a way, right? But yeah, if you need them, during a specific time in the
yeah.
year, then definitely being able to, to do this in the cloud, then that would be the sort of absolutely obvious one.
So so Vinay, one thing we haven't talked much about is this hybrid uh, uh, cloud computing model, and I think hybrid has had a little bit of trouble getting necessary traction. Like many years ago, Azure announced Azure Arc. Um, they announced, where there was actually they had Azure Stack first, where you could have the hardware, and then AWS has Outpost, and Google Cloud through their Kubernetes, Anthos. I think that is a very interesting model, although I don't see a lot, but I think that is going to grow in importance. The idea there is your data stays on-prem, but the compute infrastructure is coming from the cloud. So you've kind of separated it. So which means, see, one advantage of cloud is that all new versions and new features are now being introduced in the cloud. The on-prem vendors have sort of pushed behind. If they get to it, they get to it. But if my binaries come from the cloud, so I'm running the latest and greatest code, uh, you know, but my data never leaves my premises. Now I might be able to better meet my cost needs because I already own the hardware. It's a sunk cost, and I can also comply to my
Yeah,
regulations.
I would like actually to know how much that thing would cost you, right? Because you are actually you know you're getting a pre-configured box, and I guess you also need to have
Yeah,
some kind of service agreement with the cloud provider to come and service the hardware, right? because they are probably the only ones that would be
Right.
allowed to touch it.
So Vinay, there's now so many different models. If it's Outpost, yes, absolutely. It is a lockdown hardware appliance that you get from AWS. If it is Azure, then Azure has two models. You can either buy their appliance or you can have your own appliance. You're responsible for packing it up and networking. All they say is we need this much space in your data center and this much power. So that's model number two. Then there's model number three, like Google Cloud says, uh, it's not even nothing to do with hardware. It's all containerized. Uh, it's the Docker container, uh, and Kubernetes is being used as a single pane of glass to monitor and administer all of these. So, so now it's a software only. Actually, Azure Arc is software only. Azure Stack was appliance. So there are many different ways by which you can actually have this hybrid multi-cloud environment.
So how about, data floating in all these different environments? As somebody who's been in the database, industry for quite a while, it makes me nervous in a way, right? What about security? So what about the security issues when using the cloud, right? I mean, yes, we know that hyperscalers, they have armies of very qualified experts, and they have more expertise than enterprises, right, who are actually consuming, right? Because they are, the cloud providers are serving many, many companies, so they can afford to actually invest into very, very qualified staff as well, right? But I mean, is it that secure, right? I mean, at the end of the day, it's a shared model, right? It's not like, yes, it's running on Amazon, so I don't need to take care of anything. It's just all secure.
Yeah, so security is a very touchy topic. We have to look at so is cloud secure? Uh, and you say it's a shared model because there are two layers. There's what cloud providers are responsible for, and what you as a consumer are responsible for. I have to say, if we look at the lower layer, the infrastructure layer, I think cloud data centers are definitely secure. In fact, in most cases, even more secure than your own data center. They have firewalls at every different layer, and like a company like Azure spends $1 billion every year on securing. And I don't think end users can even match the kind of investment that goes into security. But then the the whole security starts falling apart when you go to the top half of it, which is your applications, your data layer, uh, putting tokens in your hard coding tokens in your applications, or not securing your passwords enough, so your database goes on to ransomware. So to me, those problems happen everywhere. Whether it's on-prem or cloud, we hear more about cloud these days, but they happen on-prem too. We just don't hear too much about it because it's a company's responsibility. So, the human aspect, what I'm saying, that human aspect of leaving back door open can happen anywhere.
Yeah.
In the cloud, I am seeing, by the way, there is a massive disconnect between the CISO, who's like traditionally focused on application and infrastructure security, and data security. So there's a dichotomy between data security and application security. I've been proposing that data security needs to become a first-class citizen. Not for like today, these are silos, and unless there's an attack, these two teams don't really collaborate very much.
But I can imagine also, having like, for example, Amazon, it's hundreds of services. So basing an infrastructure on that, you as the customer also, you need to understand how to use this, because you do something wrong. I mean, it's not autopilot, right? You need to know what you're doing.
Yeah, that was my initial point. Yeah, it tripped me. This is why I think managed services are good. And how do you handle this? So there are so many different ways you can do it. You can say, well, I'm going to use cloud, then I don't want any PII information. So I'm going to mask everything. Okay, that's great. Now you don't have sensitive information, but now you certainly reduce the agility of your data. So the data scientists are like, well, I don't know how to train my model because this is all like synthetic data, or it's not, representative of my actual data. So we definitely, I think security is, once again, I'm starting to see is become, security and data quality are two concepts that have reared their ugly heads because not enough has been done on these two topics.
When we talk about security and data, we talk also very often, we think about compliance, right? I mean, in terms of compliance and being able to use hyperscalers from the US, right? Typically, there are data residency issues, there are localization, there's sovereignty, right? In the EU, we talk about TREMS, TREMS 2, which basically says, you as an enterprise, if you're putting PII on a US hyperscaler, right, you have a risk that that it is not compliant, right? I mean, companies who are in regulated industries, they are used to regulations, they are used to compliance, right? They are used to these things. The problem with the GDPR is that when it came in force, suddenly, compliance is relevant to all companies, not just to the regulated industries.
Yeah.
So suddenly, even like, small companies, they have to think about what they're storing and where they're storing it, right? But I guess so. The first thing, Shrems 2, is that more of a EU problem rather than a US?
Most definitely. We don't worry about shrimps too in the US. I'm being facetious. We do worry about regulations, but it's not at the same level as our European counterparts do.
Although, I would actually argue, I was looking up the, there's this tracker for fines. The largest fines, given, GDPR fines have been given to US headquartered companies. So Amazon last year, they paid 746 million euros in fines to the EU. WhatsApp, again last year, 225 million euros. Google Ireland, 90 million euros earlier this year. Facebook, 60 million euros earlier this year. Marriott, 20 million euros in 2018, right? So in a way, I do recognize that, yes, usually, the US companies don't worry too much about TREMS 2. But actually, GDPR is actually also very relevant to US headquartered companies because, being global businesses, they also actually store, manage, process, data from EU citizens, right?
Yep. And Vinay, I was referring to shrimps too when I said, that Europe is more into it. But when it comes to overall compliance, it's now everywhere. We have to pay attention to it. I'll give you an example. Right now in California, they have CCPA. And CCPA has been around for about 2 years. But I remember when CCPA was coming into existence, there were these meetings that were taking place, and some of my friends were actually attending those. Big businesses or people with vested interest, they kept watering it down and down and down to a point where it was not really that effective. Now, in less than 2 months in California, we're going to have CPRA, which is very close to GDPR, and CPRA means business. CPRA is now not even open to challenge. It'll have its own governing body and enforcement authority, and it is laying down the law. Every state in the US is debating with various degrees of success whether to have their own laws. And I won't be surprised if in a few years the federal government says, this is it, we cannot have 50 different regulations floating around. We just going to have one federal one. GDPR is a shining light. a lot of these companies are taking GDPR as a baseline, and some of them are going even beyond GDPR. So compliance is really, really important, even in the
Yeah, yeah.
US.
I mean, the thing is, we have seen some repatriation of of cloud data, right, in the EU, from public clouds to local infrastructure. But so I guess it's not that easy, right? But do you see it happening? There has been some talk about it, but it seems that looking at the market numbers, the cloud keeps growing anyway.
Yeah, and all these hyperscalers, US based hyperscalers, they all now have uh, a pretty robust set of data centers in Europe, Middle East, Africa, Asia. So and they are also very strict in how the data moves between their data centers. So they're providing that local infrastructure to store the data in the geographical region. Now, what customers do with it is really up to them and the risk they are taking in moving the data. They shouldn't be. I'm starting to see. I spend a lot of time in the data security authorization, dynamic data authorization space. So we are now starting to see maturity of these companies that are providing products that will automatically, filter out the data based on your location. However, the with VPN and all of these things, it's easy to trick the system, but there are steps being put in place to ensure data residency laws are
Right.
maintained.
So I guess we are sort of coming to the end of this this podcast. Do you want to summarize a bit the conversation we had?
Yeah, so I think cloud computing is, in my mind, is a way to go unless you have extenuating circumstances that will not let you go there, even in Europe, especially. Royal Air Force, you just name it, like, all these large government institutions are now in the cloud, but tread carefully, look at all the deployment models, and then pick the deployment model that best meets your security, cost, latency, uh, compliance needs, and try to minimize your dependence on proprietary products if you can. Although again, your use case will dictate what you end up picking.
All right. Thank you, Sanjeev. So this has been a fascinating discussion on cloud infrastructure, what it means for databases, enterprises running databases on them, cost aspects, cloud lock-in, compliance, security. So thank you very much for joining us. This has been a pleasure. And on our next episode, we will have Christian Kuntop from Booking.com. So Booking.com is one of the world's largest travel marketplaces, and they operate thousands of database servers across multiple data centers. So Christian is the head of databases there, and he will join us to talk about the challenges of running data infrastructure at enterprise scale. Thank you all. That's it for now. Goodbye.
Thanks for checking out this episode of Sovereign DBaaS Decoded, brought to you by Severalnines, the leader in intelligent multi-cloud database orchestration solutions for open source and source available databases. Like what you've heard in this episode? Then just follow the Sovereign DBaaS Decoded podcast wherever you listen to your favorite podcast, or visit severalnines.com/podcast to get access to all the latest episodes.